Aaron, good morning. Welcome back to the program.
I'm Brian Mary Biscuit. Thanks so much for having me back this morning.
So we find ourselves in kind of an odd position with the statewide races this morning, Aaron. Friday afternoon, a story broke about John Reid, who is the Republican candidate for lieutenant governor. He is an openly gay man, and someone had posted a Tumblr account that had a handle he's used on other social media, and it had what we are just going to call lewd pictures of men on it. He said that this is an attempt to get him out of the race, that this is not his account, and that he has never posted any sort of this sort of thing online. We are hearing rumors now that Matt Moran, an advisor to Governor Youngkin, may have something to do with this. We don't know what's going on, but to make it that much odder, while the governor has asked him to get out of the race, we've heard nothing from the lieutenant governor, Winsome Sears, the attorney general, Jason Miyares, or the chairman of the party, Mark Peake. What do you think is going on here?
Yeah, I don't really think that you're going to I don't think you're going to hear a lot of commentary from anybody other than the governor's office. He's the highest-ranking Republican in the party right now, and he's the one that's going to continue to be the one that, if somebody is going to comment on the matter, that he's going to be the one that's ultimately going to do that. It seems as if that John Reid, he's still out and about on the campaign trail, and it actually looks as if over the weekend he was actually down in the Southwest Virginia area next to Representative Morgan Griffith, who represents the 9th congressional district. A portion of your listeners probably reside in his district. But Morgan Griffith was actually quoted as saying that he would always support the party's nominee. Now, while he didn't name Reid specifically, even though Reid was there with him, he said that he was always going to support the party's nominee for these statewide offices. And it is something that Republicans, I think, inevitably are grappling with a much deeper question here. Yes, it is. Everyone is obviously talking about the pictures themselves, or if this account is in fact connected to Reid. I think it returns back to a much deeper question within the Republican Party: is will Republicans support a homosexual candidate? And from the most recent visit that Reid had in Southwest Virginia, it didn't seem as if that support was waning. And this is a very, very red, very conservative area where he was located. Again, with Representative Griffith, you actually had many individuals within that area that had stated that they were not that they were actually finding out the news, number one, about the Tumblr account, but number two, there were folks that were at this meeting in Southwest Virginia stating that it was the first time they had ever heard that Reid was actually a gay man. But you had different members throughout the community. Say, for example, Wayne Stevens, he's a Washington County supervisor, who said that he was still going to go out and put yard signs throughout that area for Reid. That he was quoted as saying that this is just a dust up, if you will. That this is something where that once the dust settles, this whole thing is going to blow over, and that life will get back to normal here. So it is. I think it is something that Republicans inherently are grappling with. It's a much deeper question that Republicans are continuing to grapple with, other than just the Tumblr account and the pictures themselves. But ultimately, I think if anybody is going to lead on this conversation, it's going to be Governor Youngkin.
Well, then let's talk more about this, how this specifically may affect the race. Reid did not raise nearly as much money as Pat Harity had before Harity dropped out. And one of at least that advantage there is he would be able to raise money going into the general, wouldn't have to spend anything for the primary. You'd think that a big source of that money would be the governor and people the governor taps. You kind of wonder, is that gone now? How does that affect the race? And if you're the governor, can you go back on this at this point and say, oh, yeah, well, sure, never mind, I'm going to raise money for John Reid? I mean, that seems kind of difficult to me.
Yeah, I don't necessarily. I don't necessarily think that it will be something that, even if the governor maybe is not wholly on board with this, I don't know that it is something that he can ultimately withhold money from it, because it's going to impact his current lieutenant governor. And so if he's saying, well, I'm just going to give money over here, but I'm not going to give it to anybody else, it's inevitably going to fracture the party. Especially, there are those within the party itself that are very excited excited about the slate of candidates that are currently running. Many Republicans who have stated that the party needs to add more diversity to its ranks are saying that this is by far, and I would agree with them in this assessment, this is by far the most diverse slate of candidates that we've had potentially ever within the GOP statewide offices. You have, obviously, the current Lieutenant Governor Winsome Earle-Sears. She is running, obviously, as the governor. Then you have, again, Reid running as lieutenant governor. And then you have Jason Miyares, who comes from Hispanic origins, that he's running for re-election. So many are touting this as being an extraordinarily diverse slate that will, in fact, be able to play well, say, for example, with independent candidates. And so I think that if the polling numbers start showing that this slate, that they're picking up steam, even though that the fundraising numbers haven't been all that great thus far, I don't see where the governor could withhold money to support not just Reid, but to potentially not support the entire slate themselves.
Well, then to look at it from the other side, part of what Governor Youngkin wants out of this election is to solidify his legacy and see 3 Republicans win, and he can point to that and say, that's just another sign of how successful I was as governor when he's running for whatever office it might be. You think that wins out?
I think so, particularly the fact that whether it's his fault or not, he was the governor when Republicans lost control of the General Assembly. And even though again, it was the first election after redistricting, and that in many areas was playing against Republicans, even though there were many factors that we have to take into account there, he was still the governor when that occurred. And so he does not want to add this to his legacy where Republicans then they then lose those 3 statewide offices while he's leaving office.
Speaking with Aaron Van Allen, professor of government at Liberty University here on the Morning Line. All right, well, let's turn to some other things here. First, to stop in Congress and talk about President Trump's 100 days. All right, it's more or less, 4 or 5 weeks for the GOP to pass the big, beautiful bill with the spending and the border measures and everything else. You've got people pulling it both way from either ends of the caucus. What do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, there's still this fracturing right now as to how exactly how Republicans are going to offset these, especially once Republicans extend the Trump era tax cuts. This is something that we've seen a lot of numbers that have been thrown out, but 2 numbers that we can generally accept is that if these tax cuts are extended, that's going to lessen about $4.5 trillion worth of revenue to come into the national government, and Republicans at this present moment have only been able to find about $2.2 trillion in cuts overall. Now, many Republicans have obviously pushed back on that and said, well, that's a different viewpoint of economic policy, that once we have these tax cuts, it's going to bring in more revenue. So even though that, again, we don't, on the front end, we don't have money coming in, we are certainly still going to have that occurring. But this is something that the big issue seemingly right now, going through the House Appropriations Committees, but even the Ways and Means Committee as well, that everybody's still fighting over has continued to be Medicaid. That Republicans just seemingly cannot get on board or come to an agreement over many of these cuts. And we have to remember that Medicaid is a program that services or covers more than 70 million people, and many of those individuals reside in Republican districts. So you take, for example, Representative Nicole Malliotakis. She's a Republican from New York, and she had actually stated that she was not going to vote for anything that was going to take any support away from seniors, from what she called disabled and vulnerable people that rely on Medicaid within her district. And then you have some other Republicans as well that are starting to look at potentially some really big cuts. Some are looking as high as $2 billion in those cuts, and they're just not going on. They're not getting on board with it. So you already have a few holdouts right now that are stating that if Republicans try to cut, try to cut Medicaid, then they're not going to get on board with it. I think once they get past this hurdle and they can come to an agreement on some different areas like military spending as well, I think that ultimately that they are going to be able to get this thing across the finish line. particularly since last month they had the budget reconciliation framework that they had worked out with the Senate as well. But this Medicaid debate just seems to be the burr in the saddle for the GOP right now.
Yeah, it's hard to cut $2 trillion when you leave things like that out. You've only got $950 billion to work with.
That's right.
It makes it a difficult,
exactly right.
a difficult job. All right, so let's talk about President Trump. His first 100 days, he was more organized coming into office this time than in 2017. I think it would be fair to say he's seen his poll numbers, certainly at least for him, have been better than they were to start off. His first time around, that is changing a bit now as his personal numbers are dropping, especially going down on the economy. We've seen consumer confidence take a hit recently. Where does the president stand for 100 days, and what does he do to make sure that he's got momentum still when as we go forward in the year?
Yeah, so his numbers at the beginning of the year had actually, at the beginning of the calendar year, had started off pretty strong, but those have started to wane the closer that he's gotten to his 100th day in office. You have a couple of different polls that have recently come out. Number one, you have an NBC poll that was actually stating that about 55% of Americans did not approve of the way that he was handling the economy right now, and you start to see some of the different numbers that have come out. Say, for example, machinists. They've started to see their costs that have risen about 17% in the past couple of months, and the reason being is because a lot of tools, a lot of machines that they are using here domestically or even just the parts themselves that they are imported from China, and China is the number one exporter of all things machinery on the planet. In the United States, we are the number one importer of those products, and so seeing those costs rising, you started to see some folks have become disgruntled with that writ large. But then you also have another. It was an AP in NORC Center for Public Affairs Research poll that was put out over the weekend as well that actually found that about 53% of Americans were disapproving of President Trump and how he has been handling the immigration issue. So it is something that many people would say you have to take these polls with a grain of salt, which I would acknowledge, but it is something that those poll numbers writ large, no matter where it is that you're looking, those poll numbers are starting to slip. And as you mentioned, Brian, what seems to be leading that charge is these tariffs and how those costs are starting to rise on the American economy.
All right, well, then let's go ahead and get out on this question. Does this incentivize the Trump administration to get moving and make deals on trade rather than have these tariffs taking the effect on the economy that it looks like they're going to have?
He says that he's going to slow things down a little bit. I just don't necessarily. President Trump has never been one that's necessarily gone back on things that he has done. He firmly believes when he makes a decision that it is the right decision, and so it could potentially be something that the Treasury Secretary Scott Bassett or even some of his closest advisors could come in. Say, for example, even like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, that they could come in and say, hey, for diplomatic reasons or even for just sheer economic reasons, we need to pull down this 124% tariff that we have going on with China right now. We need to maybe we shouldn't have gone so hard so fast. We need to just temper some of our expectations a little bit further. I'm not totally sold that the president is going to do that, however, even though that those polling numbers are starting to slip for him. I think that he firmly believes that that the American economy is strong enough to where it can outlast any type of temporary pain for what he believes will be some type of a long-term game, particularly seeing that if Trump wants to do something, he just fires off an executive order, and we have no reason, at least at this point, to believe that he is going to do that.
All right, we'll leave it there. Aaron Van Allen, professor of government at Liberty University. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back, guys.